This webinar. I'm Dr. Nand Kishore from Hyderabad. Uh, we thought we'll make this webinar more about decision making. So I have two of my colleagues here from Hyderabad, Dr. Manoj Mathur, who is an very senior consultant in glaucoma working at Swaroop Eye Center and Medivision Eye Hospitals. He is an excellent teacher, apart from being a very good administrator. So he'll talk to you about decision making in glaucoma, which drug to use when. Then I have my second colleague, Dr. Madhukar Reddy, whom most of you must be knowing. He's a very, very senior corneal surgeon trained in Australia and then worked as a consultant at LV Prasad Eye Institute for quite some time before starting his own Drishti Eye Center in Hyderabad. He is also with us in the Laser Center. And I am Dr. Nand Kishore. I've been practicing on my own. I have my own setup. We also run a laser center for the past 19 years. We have been running it, and I look after most of the affairs. So with this brief introduction, Dr. Madhukar will be talking to you on uh, which premium IOL to use when, and I will be talking to you on which type of surgery, refractive surgery you need to do when. With this short introduction, I will hand you over to Dr. Manoj Mathur. He is going to start his talk.
Okay. So, welcome to you all. I bring greetings from Swaroop Eye Center and Medivision at Hyderabad. I shall be speaking about decision making in glaucoma, which drug to choose and when. This basically involves the treatment philosophy and to know about the pharmacokinetics about the drug, and then the mechanism of action, and then when to use, what are the indications and contraindications. So let us start from the scratch. The definition of a glaucoma says it's a family of ocular diseases characterized by progressive optic neuropathy and visual field loss that involves progressive retinal ganglion cell loss, which results in gradual optic disc cupping, and that is associated with visual field defects. So the structural change is the gradual cupping of the optic disc, and that is resulting in functional defects, that is the defects in the visual fields. Elevated intraocular pressure is no longer included in the definition as per the AAO clinical practice pattern. But it is the most important risk factor, and in therapeutics, that is probably the only factor which we can modulate. So the medical management of glaucoma, we need to have considered two types of glaucomas. Number one is the angle closure glaucoma, which can be acute as well as chronic, and primary open angle glaucoma. Acute angle closure glaucoma, we need to manage, number one, with the osmotic reduction of aqueous or vitreous volume. We can give IV mannitol or oral glycerol. Aqueous formation reduction like carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, then trying to open up the closed angle by giving pilocarpine or by physical corneal indentation with a indentation gonioscope. And then we need to give supportive therapy by way of NSAIDs, injectable antiemetics, and adequate hydration. Chronic angle closure glaucoma, we need to use pilocarpine to physically open up the angle, and then we can plan a YAC PI, especially if it is on a positional field. So the treatment is that of primary open angle glaucoma. Primary open angle glaucoma. What is the aim to prevent nerve fiber loss, to prevent any further visual field deterioration, that is a structural defect, the nerve fiber loss need to be prevented, loss of RGCs, you must preserve the visual field, and most important is to retain the quality of life for the patient. If you see this graph here, as the age advances, there is a physiological loss of RGCs which run in this fashion. But if you detect the disease at this point, if you don't treat, there is a rapid loss of RGCs and the patient can become blind. So the aim of treatment is to skew this curve. Instead of running it down this way, you have to skew it so that the curve runs, the loss of RGCs run parallel to the normal physiological loss. So the basic aim of treatment of glaucoma is to not to stop the loss of RGCs, but the RGCs continue to be lost, but this loss should be running parallel to the loss of physiological loss of RGCs. The visual field deterioration at the point of detection, suppose even if the visual defect is advanced so much, the aim of the treatment should be to preserve this visual field of the patient. The quality of life of the patient is very important, hard to quantify, but for the patient, it is everything. The diagnosis generates anxiety. Mind you, the moment you diagnose, tell the patient, probably you are having glaucoma, be rest assured, patient may not be able to sleep peacefully. Functional loss due to the disease. Always this disease will be bothering the patient. Inconvenience of treatment. It is very simple for us to prescribe 2 or 3 drops to be used for the rest of your life. How inconvenient it is. Side effects of the treatment. Thought needs to be given. And last but not the least, especially in our middle class setup, in our country like a developing country, cost is definitely a factor to be factored in. Then what we can do? In glaucoma, we can only modify or control the IOP. Can we afford some sort of a neuroprotection, or can we afford some sort of vasoprotection to the patient as a bonus? You need to assess every drug in these parameters. How much is the modification, how much is the ability to control the IOP? Can you give some sort of a neuroprotection and vasoprotection? How much pressure to be reduced? Again, depends on 3 major factors. Number 1, the amount of damage that you detect when you diagnose glaucoma, the life expectancy of the patient. If the patient's age is more at the time of detection, probably you can have a higher target pressure. If the age of the patient is very less when at the time of detection, then you have to aggressively manage by reducing the target pressure. IOP, the baseline IOP at which the damage has occurred, also contributes to the calculation of target pressure. Can you afford to give some sort of a neuroprotection, or can you afford some sort of a vasoprotection? What do you mean by vasoprotection? Can you give increase in microcirculation that results, or can the drug induce some sort of a vasodilatation that increases the perfusion, and this increased perfusion leads to prevention of loss of RGCs. So the goal, the ultimate goal of glaucoma treatment resolves around what all we have discussed till now boils down to this one particular statement: preservation of visual function adequate to the individual needs with minimal or no side effects for the expected lifetime of the patient without any disruption of his or her normal activities at a sustainable cost. So everything what we have discussed till now boils down to this one statement, and we need to assess every drug, whether how much it is
clarity
relating or functionally coming up to satisfy this particular statement. So, preservation of visual function relates to aim and efficacy of your medication, adequate to individual needs, whether you are able to achieve the target pressure, minimal or no side effects, what is the safety profile of the drug that you want to use, for the expected lifetime of the patient, can you prevent blindness without any disruption of normal activities, that is, quality of life for your patient at a sustainable cost that results in improved compliance of the drug for your patient. Then you need to know the mechanism of action. How do anti-glaucoma medications act? Basically, they act as 2 types. Number 1 is the inflow reductors. That is, they reduce the inflow of aqueous secretion from the ciliary body. Then the second mechanism of action is the outflow facility. Outflow facility is mainly through the uveoscleral outflow, and some more drugs, they also promote trabecular outflow. So this we need to know. Either you have to reduce the inflow or you have to facilitate the outflow. And this is basic principal mechanism of action of the anti-glaucoma medication. So if you see, what are the outflow facilitators available in your armamentarium? They are basically prostamides, alpha-2 agonists, cholinergics, prostaglandins, and the latest in the inventory that are the ROCK inhibitors. And inflow reductors are alpha-2 agonists, beta-1 beta blockers, and carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So every drug that is available for us to use you need to assess upon these three parameters. Number one, the ability to modify the IOP. Number two, whether they are having, you need to assess their ocular and systemic side effects. And number three, can you afford to give, as I told earlier, some sort of a neuroprotection and vasoprotection to the optic nerve head that helps in reducing the loss of RGCs. So, number one drug, in the first drug that was used in the management of glaucoma are the cholinergic drugs, that is the pilocarpine. How does it act? It acts by the physical stretch on the ciliary body. It opens up the angle to and improves the trabecular flow. But the complications, that are the side effects of this drug, are basically visual disturbances because of meiosis, and it precipitates also brow ache. This is sometimes a factor where you realize, especially when you want to do a PI and you put pilocarpine to the patient complains of headache and brow ache. The advantages, the bonus of this medication is it is a cheaper medication, efficacy is reasonably good. Even in today's practice, don't write off this product. This product really works, especially in some refractory cases. The invention of beta blockers in the 70s revolutionized the treatment of glaucoma. And how do they act? They act by reduction or production of aqueous, but they have a side effects profile. The side effect profile is very important. Pulmonary and the cardiac side effects, you can't use this drug in cardiac blocks, and pulmonary precipitates bronchospasm and pulmonary dysfunction. And the common complications of this side effects are depression, tiredness, bradycardia. Timolol over a long period of time, say after use of 4 to 5 years, it results in tachyphylaxis, and because of persistent vasoconstriction. This is the common side effect of this drug which we need to assess. Levobunolol to a certain extent and betoxolol, the selective beta blocker, this causes vasodilatation, and for maintenance after subsequently in my earlier phase of practice, of starting the patient with timolol, after 2 to 3 years, we used to shift the patient over levobunolol and betoxolol for this reason. And the efficacy was reasonably good. Since we didn't have other molecules for the management, we used to manage with only these two drugs. Then came on the block the alpha-2 agonists in the 80s and the 90s. How do they act? They reduce the production of aqueous as well as they increase the uroscleral outflow. The common side effects of this drug was hyperemia and drowsiness, and they were shown to give some sort of a neuroprotection to the patients. And this was established in animal models, but yet to be conclusively proved in humans. And the efficacy of this medication was again almost equivalent to timolol. Timolol is still the gold standard, and all the new molecules invented compared their efficacy with the efficacy of beta blockers, that is the timolol. Then came the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. How do they act? They again act by reducing the production of aqueous, but mind you, this reduction of production of aqueous is by a different mechanism. It is not through the sodium-potassium pump, but it is through the carbonic anhydrase inhibition. That is, carbonic anhydrase inhibition leads to accumulation of water and carbon dioxide in the aqueous. Otherwise, this enzyme helps in combining these two molecules of water and carbon dioxide to form bicarbonate ions. When this bicarbonate accumulation is prevented, the accumulating carbon dioxide is known to give some sort of a vasoprotection to the accumulation of carbon dioxide leads to vasodilatation. Vasodilatation leads to vasoperfusion, and that is why it is very useful, supposed to be useful in management of normal tension glaucoma. The side effect profile is insignificant and no specific significant side effects demonstrated, but for some corneal decompensation. In decompensated cornea, especially corneal endothelium, this drug is to be managed with caution, better to be avoided. The other then came on the in the limelight, the prostaglandins and the prostaglandin analogs. The first on the block was latanoprost. How do they act? They act by increasing the uroscleral outflow, but you should know the side effects of this drug. They can precipitate uveitis, they precipitate macular edema, iris pigmentation, eyelash growth, and they are also supposed to effort some sort of a vasoperfusion. So with this side effect profile, in situations which are bound to precipitate, especially in the pre and post-operative situations, these prostaglandins and prostaglandin analogs should not be used, and they should, till the blood-brain barrier becomes intact, you should avoid these molecules, and these medications should not be used. The efficacy of prostaglandin and prostaglandin analogs is as compared to timolol is better. Then came the travoprost. Again, the similar safety profile, but this molecule demonstrated endurance and a better diurnal control. The bimatoprost, they demonstrated that apart from the US level outflow of 50%, there is an increase in trabecular outflow also to the extent of 35%. The same side effect profile, and again the safety profile as well as the projected vasoperfusion with these medications. Now, the fourth dimension to this armamentarium is the launch of tafluprost recently. There is the hyperemia as seen with the other molecules is very minimal. The inflammatory response of this molecule is supposed to be minimal. And again, the mechanism of action and the other safety profile is similar to the other three prostaglandin analogs. The recent launch of lipazolam as a anti-glaucoma drug plus as a drug that reforms the corneal endothelium. So it has a role in corneal conditions like Fuchs corneal atrophy, and also it is supposed to reduce the macular edema. So even in retina, in the posterior segment cases, this drug has some promise. Since it was launched very recently and immediately the lockdown followed, I don't have a personal experience with this molecule. However, going into the theory is supposed to be an anti-inflammatory property. So probably in the immediate pre and post-op conditions, this may be the drug to be tried before we try the other molecules, which needs to be looked into subsequently. Then, as I told you, it is very simple for us to prescribe medication, but how far it is convenient for the patients to use, we need to consider fixed combination drugs, so that to reduce the number of drops that a patient is expected to use per day. So the fixed combinations, they give effort more convenience, that results in improved compliance, and then diminished risk of washout from the second drug. If too many drops are instilled, you run the risk of a washout. And this limits the patient's lifetime exposure to the potential preservatives in the medications. With these advantages, it was also observed that by the ocular hypertension study, that 40% of the patients of ocular hypertension within 5 years need a second glaucoma medication. And after more than 75% needed an additional drug in the initial glaucoma treatment study, CIGPS. Initiating PGA therapy require an adjunct therapy within 2 years. This is what was noticed, that if you go for the kill in a glaucoma diagnosis with a prostaglandin or a PG analog treatment, within 2 years, you needed generally an addition of a medication. And if you had to start with a prostaglandin and beta blocker fixed combination right from the start, again within 1 year you ended up adding another anti-glaucoma medication to the treatment. So non-adherence may contribute to suboptimal IOP control and visual loss. Unfixed combination increase the number of drops, increase the schedule complexity, and may affect adherence, and medication washout is a risk with installation of multiple topical medications. So even all these studies, European Glaucoma Study and the Asia Pacific Group and the American Optometry Association, all these studies, all these associations impressed upon us the necessity of a fixed dose combination for glaucoma management. So if you see the fixed drug combinations as till the recent past, we had all these combinations like pilocarpine timolol, dorzolamide timolol, brinzolamide timolol, brimonidine timolol, latanoprost, travoprost, dimetoprost timolol. Brinzolamide and brimonidine is launched about a year or a year and a half back. This afforded promise. If you see here, all the combinations till now had a common uniting factor, that is timolol. But it was observed that in about 50% of the treatment group, beta blocker was contraindicated. So we had to use with caution. So the introduction of a brinzolamide and the dimetoprost combination increased BBFC combination, increased our scope for a better management of glaucoma. So how does it affect? Like even in just 3 brinzolamide and brimonidine, not dimetoprost. So brinzolamide and brimonidine combination and a PG analog if you use, or if you want a maximum medical therapy for your patient, just by combining a prostaglandin and a beta blocker in 1 drop a day, and then 2 combination of brinzolamide, brimonidine, BD or a TBS dose with 3 to 4 drops, you can afford maximum medical therapy for your patient. So the practical guidelines in management of glaucoma is you need to start with monotherapy. If the response is adequate, you need to continue. If the response is inadequate with one drug, you need to switch the drug to a different drug. If the response is adequate, you have achieved some sort of a pressure reduction, but the target pressure has not reached. In such a situation, you need to add a drug. And then one thing you have to remember that always add a drug that has a different mechanism of action so that the things don't mix up. So if you see this, when you are starting with monotherapy, you can start with either the alpha agonist or the beta blockers or the carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, prostaglandins or prostamides. The thing is which drug and when to use. The moment you conclusively establish the diagnosis of glaucoma, the indication is go for the kill. Start with the best possible drug, aim for a straightaway 30% reduction. And what are the drugs that afford you that kind of a reduction? It is the prostaglandins and prostamides. If you achieve your target pressure, then you can think of adding, continuing. Otherwise, you can add some medication. Or if the adequate pressure reduction is not achieved, then you can try to switch among the prostaglandins or the prostaglandin analogs. So if you see the final slide here, the clinical guidelines in medication, the first choice should be, as I said, should be monotherapy. And now if the IOP is effective, then you have to lead to target pressure is reached, continue target pressure is maintained. Periodically, you need to verify the endpoints like quality of life, as I have said, visual field, should be maintained, optic disc and IOP. Suppose if the target pressure is not reached, you need to add second drug. With that, if you get the target pressure is reached, then you can continue. If the target pressure is not reached, then in that case, you have to substitute a second drug. Whereas straight away at the start, if it is non-effective, you need to change monotherapy. If it is still not effective, then you need to consider other options like laser and surgery. If it is effective, continue and then again come back to this protocol. So this is the way, in which way, how to use what medications. If you straight away come to a diagnosis of glaucoma, go for the kill, start with a PG analog that has then you can strike a right balance in the management of glaucoma. Whereas in the immediate post-op period, or pre-op period, prostaglandin should be avoided. You can manage with beta blockers or carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, that should be the second line, or with caution, you can add brimonidine, because brimonidine is also known to cause some sort of an inflammatory response, especially in the immediate post-op period. The first choice drug that you can use should be the carbonic anhydrase inhibitor along with the beta blocker, or in situation where the beta blocker is contraindicated, then you have to use brimonidine cautiously along with brinzolamide. You can use a brinzolamide and Brimonidine combination can be used. So you have to take a call depending on the patient. No hard and fast rules, no specific algorithm, but every glaucoma case should be managed on a case per case basis. You will be able to select your anti-glaucoma medication depending on if you only know how much is the baseline pressure, how much target pressure is required, how much pressure reduction you need, what is the efficacy of each anti-glaucoma medication, what is its side effect profile, and does it offer some sort of a neuroprotection or mesoprotection. With these points in mind, you can suitably decide among your armamentarium. We don't have many drugs. We just have 7 to 8 molecules or 9 molecules at best. Within those drugs, you need to manage your patient medically. Otherwise, you need to look out for other options. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. And you can save my email address and my mobile number. In case you need to contact me by WhatsApp or by email, you are welcome to contact me for any clarifications. As of now, I think Dr. Lankishore will open for some questions. If there are any in the chat box, I can answer. Otherwise, we move on to the next one. Thank you all.
Manoj, there is one question for you in the chat box. Are you able to see it?
Yes. Okay. Premium iOS. My question is respect of sir. How can we know that who is at risk of developing glaucoma and how to pressure inside the eye and other? It is very difficult to know who is at risk. Like you need to understand the risk factors for glaucoma. Who is at risk for glaucoma is it is only empirical. Generally, the family history of glaucoma, anybody above 40 years, diabetes, hypertension, especially hypothyroids, thyroid disorders, especially hypothyroids, any frequent use of steroids or long-term use of steroids. Long-term use of steroids also imply like nasal inhalations and also steroid use, long-term steroid use by way of ointments for your dermatological issues. They even in steroid responders, that is, even if you use for dermatological issues, whenever you use steroid ointments, or for asthmatics, if you use steroid inhalations, they also in steroid responders can precipitate glaucoma. And apart from this, any history of trauma, a injury, eye that has sustained an acute or a blunt injury in the past, those eyes are more susceptible for glaucoma.
The first part of the question was, Manoj, which anti-glaucoma treatment should be started first in primary open angle? Dr. Das, R.K. Das has asked you this question.
As I told you, the moment you diagnose a case of glaucoma, so you need to first set up the target pressure. Suppose if the target pressure that you have set up is generally a well-informed treatment is, as a first step, you should straight away aim to get your target pressure. And how best to get to your target pressure? It is to go for the kill. All the prostaglandins and prostaglandin analogs are supposed to give you a reduction of between 30 to 35%. So suppose if the pressure at which you have diagnosed the case is of glaucoma is at 30. So start with monotherapy. And if 30 means you will be more comfortable in reducing the pressure to the teens. So teens means you need definitely more than 30% pressure reduction. Start on a prostaglandin or a prostaglandin analog. You will, suppose if the pressure is coming down to 20, 21 like that, persist with it. See again, follow up after some time, the pressure comes down. After sustained use, say probably after a month or two, still the pressure is in 22, 23 like that. That means you have inadequate response. In such a situation, you add a drug and then get to your target pressure. So the dictum is the moment you detect glaucoma, that is, I mean, conclusive detection. It is not empirical treatment. The moment you structurally and functionally demonstrate the glaucoma disease in a particular individual, it is better to go for the kill and start with a drug that has the potential to reduce the target, give you the target pressure and help you in reducing the intraocular pressure by at least 30%. This, in most of the situations, is adequate, and the advantages is Just a single drop at bedtime, it gives you increased compliance, and just a drop of thing, even economically, it works out well. A single bottle worth 600 to 700 lasts for over a month. So that's how you have to look into the quality of life of the patient, and you have to achieve your target patient.
So we go on to the next talk by Dr. Madhukar. Madhukar, there is already a question for you saying which is the best premium IOL. I think you can try to address that question in your talk itself.
Okay.
Share your screen now.
Good evening, everybody. My topic is about which premium IOL to use when. So I'll try to have an overview of what we normally use every day of the monofocals. Then we'll go into the premium IOLs, that is toric and multifocals. The IOLs, what we normally use, the monofocal lens, hydrophobic lenses are the best because they have least amount of posterior capsular opacification, and also they should be aspheric for better quality of vision. The next monofocal lenses are toric lenses. Toric lenses are the ones which will correct the astigmatism also. So going by what is the astigmatism prevalence in the community, so even if you take 1 as the cutoff point, because less than 1 it is quite low. So from 1 to 3, there's nearly about 40% of population will have significant astigmatism which needs correction. And even if you take 1.5, still about 30% will have significant astigmatism which you have to take care of them, because otherwise their quality of life will be less, because for distance and near they still have to wear glasses. So by correcting the astigmatism, you're giving the patient glass-free distance vision. So all of us have to be aware of this and try to correct the astigmatism, especially the higher astigmatisms. Coming to monofocal lenses, there are white lenses available and yellow lenses are available. There is a debate which is going on for many years, which is better. But what we normally do is that in case if the patient has any conditions which have less contrast, like in advanced glaucoma or retinal problems, it's better to go for a white lens, because yellow lens is supposed to decrease a little bit of contrast sensitivity. Coming to monovision, you can use one eye, the dominant eye, for distance correction, and the less dominant eye you can give for near vision correction by about -0.5. So with that, what happens is one eye will have distance vision and one eye will have functional near vision. So with that, especially patients who don't drive at night or they don't have a perfect or demanding visual acuity, then we can also give this at a lower cost to the patient. Recently, J&J has come out with Eyhance lens, which gives us good distance vision and good intermediate vision, especially for computer usage or phone usage. So this lens can be used for patients who drive at night, and we are worried about dysphotopsias. So for such patients, we can use this Eyhance lens. It's a modified monofocal lens, which has better intermediate vision. Then sulcus fixated lenses are available, which it's something like Sulcoflex lens or a 3-piece lens, wherein in case if there is a refractive surprise, or if you want to add some more power to your lens, like for example, you already have given a monofocal lens and then you want to have multifocality, then within the sulcus, you can add this lens, which Sulcoflex lens, which would give the patient multifocality. So these are the lenses which are available. Then monofocal lenses of different types, which we can use in our practice, especially when you have a surgical complication. If there's lack of capsular support, then an ACIOL, which we use, will be useful. A sulcus fixated lens is especially useful when you don't have adequate capsular support and you can't put a lens in the bag. You need to use a 3-piece lens within the sulcus, because a single piece lens in the sulcus can cause glaucoma or pigment dispersion. Then there are iris supported lenses, which you have to use fixated to the iris. So these are also, when there is less capsular support, you can use this. Then comes when there is absolutely no support, you can use scleral fixated lenses, either suture fixated or glue fixated. These are the various types of monofocal lens which we can use in our practice in the given situation. Coming to toric lenses. Toric lenses, as you see here, in this particular lens, which is the toric Alcon lens, you have a posterior surface which has this astigmatism, and you have to align this to the steep axis of the cornea. So because this, the steep axis of the cornea is the one which causes this astigmatism. We have to remember in correction of astigmatism that the nomenclature is that for the right eye, the nasal side is 0, and for the left eye, the temporal side is 0. So we need to make sure that this nomenclature is followed, because all of us have to communicate in a similar way. So we need to keep a real, be aware of such a situation. Otherwise, we tend to make mistakes in the axis. Toric lenses can be used when there is regular astigmatism. In irregular astigmatism, we can't treat with toric lenses. And keratometry and topography help in determining the amount of toricity or astigmatism. And please remember that we are not correcting refractive astigmatism, we are correcting the corneal astigmatism, because the lens also has certain astigmatism and which should not be corrected because you are removing the lens anyway during cataract surgery. So if you are using a multifocal lens, then you need to correct astigmatism up to 0.75 or 1. But even up to 1.5 cylinder, the patient can tolerate astigmatism because that will add to the depth of focus. So practically, it depends on us, depending on what type of lenses we are using, whether to use a 1 or 1.5 as the cutoff point. Lenses are available from 0 to 6 diopters at the IOL plane, and in the corneal plane that translates to 1 to 4. So up to 4 degrees of 4 diopters of astigmatism we can treat with the normal lenses. But some companies have come up with higher power astigmatic lenses also, and you can have them custom made in case if there is a very significant high astigmatism, but they're expensive, they're not available off the shelf directly. For calculation of the toricity, you need to have good pre-op keratometric data, which you can use either with a proper keratometry reading, but having access to a optical biometry is better, like your LensStar or IOL Master, because there the manual or the error is less because you're not touching the cornea there. You should know your surgically induced astigmatism, because each of us, by doing a corneal incisions or a scleral incisions, induce a certain amount of surgically induced astigmatism, which has to be corrected in this calculation. And each company has their own toric calculator, with which you can calculate the exact amount of toric power needed. The technique is that pre-operatively, you need to mark the 0-180 axis either at a slit lamp or in the sitting position with a bubble marker, and then mark it properly. And whatever is the power, the axis necessary to align the IOL. For example, you have to, if it's 68 or 78 or whatever, then you need to mark with the help of a marker on the table, and then place the IOL 15 degrees short of the intended axis, and then make sure that you remove the viscoelastic behind the IOL to prevent IOL rotation. And then you need to tap the lens back into place so that it will adhere to the posterior capsule and does not move after surgery. To summarize, for toric IOLs, it's important to know the keratometric cylinder and not the refractive cylinder. You should know your surgical induced astigmatism earlier, and make sure that you are placing the lens in the correct axis, because the lens, if it rotates, the astigmatism is the correction of astigmatism is lost, and sometimes it can enhance also if it's grossly away from the axis which you're wanting to put it. Then take care of all the pre-markings properly. And then in case you should, if there is significant astigmatism still, or if the patient is very particular, then it can be corrected with laser correction from the cornea at a later date. Now we'll discuss about multifocal IOLs or presbyopia correcting IOLs. So all of us, ideally, the patient's demand would be that they would not like to have glasses for near and distance. But as of now, IOL technology is not mature enough to give full correction, both near and distance, with the best quality of vision. So there are some downsides for multifocal IOLs, and they need to be used only in certain situations. So that's what we will discuss. So refractive IOLs, multifocal IOLs, the different types are refractive IOLs, diffractive IOLs. Again, in diffractive, there are bifocals and trifocals, and extended depth of focus lenses. So we'll see what are the advantages and disadvantages of these lenses. Refractive IOLs, as you see here, there are concentric zones of varying powers. The central one for distance, then again intermediate one for near, and then a distance lens, and then the for near as well as distance are alternate concentric rings. These are pupil dependent. If the pupil is small, then they don't give you the near vision properly. So these are the relatively older lenses like the resume lens, which is shown here. Diffractive lenses are better in terms of quality of vision and in giving multifocality. So these diffractive lenses have microscopic steps of specific phase delay, as you see here. So on the back of the lens, there are serrations here, which will cause the light to focus at different points, focal point 1 and 2. And light here is equally distributed for near and distance for various pupil diameters. So that's the advantage of diffractive lens. They are not pupil dependent. So you can comfortably, if the pupil is small or big, you can still go for a diffractive lens rather than keep measuring the pupil size and worrying about how much the patient will see. Then apodization came in, which was done by Alcon company. So initially in their Restore lenses. Here, what they do is there's a greater need for distance vision in dim illumination. And also, the lens has been designed in such a way. And there's a gradual reduction of different step height from the center to the periphery. Like as you see here, this will cause vision both for near and distance to be seen properly. Then came extended depth of focus lenses. Symphony lens is an example of this, wherein they have modified the posterior, the lens again in such a way so that instead of creating multiple foci like what you saw in the earlier lenses, like one focus here and one focus here, which causes significant visual distortion, they have created the echelet design in a different way so that there is a constant focus. So there's no sudden steps here. So that will give you a better quality of vision with less glare, relatively less glare. But the problem with these lenses was the near vision was not very good in these cases, in this lens. Then came trifocal design. Trifocal IOLs means there are 3 focal points. Again, the lens design has been modified to give you anterior, intermediate vision, distance vision, and then near vision. 3 different foci have been given, and this gives a better quality of intermediate vision. The Panoptix lens of Novartis and Atlisa of Zeiss are examples of these. We have to, whenever we discuss with the patient about, or we offer the patient what IOL we are able to give them, we need to discuss their lifestyle and what their needs are and their paying capacity also. It depends on the visual needs of the patient. Like if they are night drivers, then don't advise them a multifocal lens because it will cause dysphotopsia at night, which is difficult for them. And people who are very demanding in their visual acuity, those people, because there's relatively less contrast sensitivity after multifocal lens, you need to you should not advise them. And also people who have undergone LASIK or any refractive correction, their corneal surfaces are distorted. So for them also, again, there will be less contrast sensitivity and they might not be happy. And we have to also take into consideration that if there are any ocular surface problems, or if there are any zonular problems, or if there's any retinal problems wherein there is less than normal quality of vision, then multifocality also will cause relatively less quality of vision, and this will add to the problem. So if there is any comorbidity, so please don't use multifocal lenses or don't advise them properly, because the patient will be unhappy at the end of surgery. When you're treating multifocal lenses, in case if there is astigmatism, not 1.25, some people do up to 0.75 also. So you need to take care of the astigmatism with multifocal toric lenses, which will correct both the multifocality as well as the toricity. So such people will be about 30%. So you need to use toric multifocal lenses in such patients when you are using multifocal lenses. You'll also have to take care of posterior corneal astigmatism, because that also will add to the problem. And corneal tomography and aberrometry will take these into consideration. The newer IOL formula take these into consideration, and the newer biometric devices also take this into consideration, like the IOL Master 700. Astigmatism management, if you're not taking care of the toricity with the help of lenses, you need to use the arcuate keratotomies. If you have access to femtosecond laser, then you need to use this to decrease the astigmatism in lower powers. And then you also have to make sure that the patient's astigmatism, in case if it's persisting, have to be corrected with corneal ablation at the end of surgery to give better quality of vision to the patients. You also have to see that your patients before surgery in multifocal lenses do not have dry eye, which are or have a residual astigmatism, or they should not have any faint corneal scars, dystrophies, or pterygia, which are distorting the corneal surface. The previous refractive surgery or significant corneal aberrations which are existing for the patient also affect your corneal quality of vision. So they cause decreased contrast, and there can be intolerable dysphotopsia with high aberrations. And monofocal aspheric lenses are better in myopic LASIK. Please remember this, and all your LASIK patients, especially myopes, suggest only monofocal lenses. And also, it's difficult to calculate the correct IOL power calculation in post-refractive surgery patients. And that also will be an additional surprise for you and the patient. If there are zonular weaknesses because of pseudoexfoliation or past trauma or any other hereditary condition, then in such cases, you should avoid multifocal lenses because of various reasons. Then some eyes have an increased angle kappa, which means that there is a difference, or both the pupillary axis and the visual axis don't coincide. So that's when also aberrations will be more, and that will cause increased photic phenomena, and such patients should be avoided, and these have to be evaluated before surgery. If there are any retinal or optic nerve pathologies, if there is any macular edema, if there is any age-related macular degeneration, in such conditions also, you should not use multifocal lenses. Coming to visual outcomes compared to diffractive versus refractive lenses. So it has been shown in many studies that diffractive lenses are better than refractive surgeries in both distance acuity and similar intermediate vision is there in such cases, but there is a better near vision in diffractive groups. Glare and halos are also lower in diffractive lenses. So in general, we should remember that diffractive lenses are better than refractive lenses. The similar, this one, even compared to accommodative lenses, which we had used for some time, but they were not practical and they were not giving good quality of vision, and they had more complications. So diffractive lenses are better than accommodative lenses. Trifocal lenses are better for intermediate vision, and at-LISA fine vision panoptic lenses are the ones which are available in the market. If the patient has even a small amount of posterior capsular opacification, that also decreases contrast sensitivity, and especially in multifocal lenses, these will add to the decrease in quality of vision, and you have to make sure that you treat capsular opacification as early as possible in multifocal lenses so that the patient will have better quality of vision. And in hydrophilic lenses, these PCO rates are higher. Photic phenomena is one which we fear in multifocal lenses because when patients drive at night or see bright lights, they'll have halos and glare around them. And this is more in compared to monofocal lenses. There are also, compared to diffractive lenses, this problem is more in refractive lenses. Even though with time, they decrease with neuroadaptation, still it's bothering for the patient. So we have to make sure during counseling that patients don't go for multifocal lenses unnecessarily, and especially those who are demanding visual needs. And hence, approximately as of now, about 10 to 20% of patients only will be good for multifocal lenses in anybody's practice. Suppose somebody is saying I use 50% or 70% of my patients have multifocal lenses, means that you're likely to have trouble with the patient's quality of vision when they come back. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Answer the question.
Yeah.
Among all premium IOLs available in India, which is the best? There's nothing like a best lens. Each lens has their own requirement of the patient as well as what a lens provides. For example, if suppose somebody has astigmatism, then you need to go for a good quality lens. And then I use a lot of Acrisof lenses, that is Alcon or Novartis company lenses. And a lot of them I do use PanOptix lenses for trifocal lenses, and a toric lens I use also biotech lenses, which are also reasonably good. So it depends on what the patient needs, their economic status, and what's available in the market. There's nothing like one lens fits all.
Yeah, Madhukar, I was asking you a question. How do you differentiate what is the quantum of lenticular astigmatism and what's the corneal astigmatism? The second question is, would you prefer a multifocal IOL in high myopes? So you partly answered that question. And third thing is...
let's go one by one.
Yeah. No, let me ask, then I'll start sharing my screen. Okay. Third thing is, it's always said that there some amount of residual astigmatism helps you in your near vision. So how much amount of astigmatism would you aim to correct?
Fine. Yeah, coming to the first question, that can you tell me again? What was the first question you asked?
Yeah, how do you know what is the quantum of lenticular astigmatism and what's the amount of corneal astigmatism to decide how much to correct?
Yeah, as I told you, we should not go by refractive correction. For example, a patient has a -3 cylinder. So, but if you take the keratometry reading, it shows only -1 cylinder. So you have to treat the -1 cylinder. For example, on keratometry, what is the astigmatism you come across? You always check with the second instrument if you have a doubt. And then once after 2 or 3 readings, go by only the keratometric reading, what your IOL master or your LensStar machine gives, or what your keratometer gives. Don't go by the refractive correction. That's what I mean. If there is a difference, if both are matching, it means there's no lenticular astigmatism. If they are not matching, it means that the remaining astigmatism, that is in my example what I gave you, in case if it's -3 for the refractive astigmatism and only -1 cylinder for the corneal correction, then those -2 is the lenticular astigmatism, which you should ignore. The second question is regarding high myopes. Yeah, in high myopes, I usually will try to avoid giving a multifocal lens, because the higher the power, there will be a mismatch. But in case if the patient demands, in case if they say that, you have to tell them that there might be residual power remaining when you're treating higher powers, either myopia or hyperopia. But in general, higher hyperopic patients have a better satisfaction with multifocal lenses compared to myopes, because myopes are already seeing good near vision. and then whatever multifocality you give, they won't be able to see as better. So that's the reason they're not very happy. So high myopes, I would like to avoid multifocals unless the patient is very demanding, and then you explain to them what exactly they are getting into. The third question is about what amount of astigmatism to be left behind. So
yeah, because
normally,
they say some amount of residual astigmatism would aid near vision.
yes, I agree. Up to 1.5, I normally don't treat astigmatism. Only more than 1.5, I recommend a toric lens for the patient. But if it is a multifocal lens, then even up to 1, I correct the astigmatism.
So I'll get on to my topic now.
Yeah, there is a question.
Yeah.
In piggyback lens, what are the chances of developing interlens opacities, asked by Dr. Ajay Pandey. So I've done significant amount of, whenever there's a problem like a refractive surgery, especially earlier. So there's no problem with them. Patients are usually happy. Lens opacity, I've not come across.
Yeah. So I'll get on to my talk. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
So as most of us know, there are different kinds of refractive surgery. The most common things being surface ablation, or which is otherwise known as PRK, where you tend to remove only the epithelium either by the laser itself or by scraping off using alcohol or some topical anesthetic drops. The second procedure is where you try to create a flap, which is called as LASIK. It can be either a conventional microkeratome LASIK, where you use a microkeratome to create a flap, and then it can be a femto LASIK, where you use the femto laser for creating a flap. Third procedure, of course, can be a smile, where you don't create a flap at all in most of the cases. In fact, you don't use the excimer laser here. You just have create a lenticule by photo separation, and then through a small opening, you will try to remove the lenticle to give the refractive correction. Apart from this, of course, the other procedures which you have to talk about in refractive surgery are intra ICL and clear lens extraction. So with this brief introduction, over the last 19-20 years, I am talking mostly about the protocols and algorithms which I follow in my practice to decide whether I should do a surface ablation, a femto LASIK, or a conventional LASIK. What are my considerations in doing that? And then if it is not found suitable, whether I go in for a clear lens extraction or a ICL. So I base my concept. Yeah, I take these following points as the guiding issues in decision making as far as my refractive surgery practice is concerned. One is the family history, second is the anatomical considerations, third is the pachymetry issues, topography guidelines, then the quantum of refractive error, then presence of corneal pathology or any previous history of any previous corneal surgery, affordability issues, which is a very, very important factor. Then if nothing is suitable, then you think of measuring the corneal diameter, AC depth, specular microscopy, etc., etc. We'll go one by one. Family history, I'm very, very stressing on this point very much because I have had many cases where I planned for LASIK and then I had to change my surgery at the last minute after the patient came to the surgical center, just because I found that one of the siblings or one of the family members, closely blood relative, I have treated for keratoconus. So if there is some family history of keratoconus, even if all the parameters, other parameters point towards a possibility of a LASIK or a femto-LASIK, I would prefer to do a surface ablation in all these cases, provided the amount of refractive error is not more than 6 diopters, and no other contraindication for surface ablation is there. You can sometimes proceed with a femtoLASIK in such cases, provided you are very sure you can read your topography indices very clearly. And nowadays, people are doing even surgery for suspect cases. So there is this process is still in evolution. But at the present point of time, I would stick myself to doing a surface ablation for all those patients where there is a suggestive family history. Anatomical considerations, very often when you finally take the patient to the operating table, you find that the palpebral fissure is very narrow. It's very difficult in these cases to introduce the suction ring or the cone, and even a small, and they have very severe blepharospasm in most of these cases. So when you are trying to attempt to cut a flap, then a strong squeeze can create so many problems, and you have to postpone the case. You can end up with a incomplete flap and all these cases. So again, here my procedure of first choice would be a surface treatment. Of course, there have been cases where the palpebral fissure was very narrow. With a little technique and with a little experience, you can manage to introduce your femtocone in such cases and try to hold the lids apart by using a small wire speculum. But for me, in such cases where the fissure is very narrow, I would definitely try and avoid a regular microkeratome LASIK. So again, the first choice would be a surface ablation. And if you are confident, if you are experienced enough, maybe femto LASIK would be an alternative. Pachymetry is probably one of the most important guiding parameters to decide. Uh, there have been many suggestions, algorithms, protocols which are being followed, but mind you, nothing is legal. It is only out of experience that so many different values have been arrived at. And in our own practice at our center, we generally avoid anything less than 460 micron thickness for any kind of laser refractive procedure, any kind of corneal procedure. 470 and above would be something which is suitable, either PRK, LASIK or femtoLASIK. Again, this depends on two things. One is the thickness which is available, the amount of refractive error to be corrected, and then the third thing also would be the pupil diameter in these cases. Anything more than 500 microns thickness, again, it may be suitable depending on the refractive error. For all the three procedures, you got to take a call on this. And one of the guiding principles to know how much amount of tissue you are ablating would be the Muller-Lens formula, which is again, the amount of tissue which you are removing is optic zone square into the number of diopters which should be corrected, divided by 3, which should serve as a broad guideline. It's not an absolute. It varies again from machine to machine. So this generally gives you a broad guideline. If you can just put a approximate figure in this, and then you can arrive at a figure which tells you how much is the amount of tissue to be ablated. Just for an example, of late, the amount of PTA or the percentage of tissue altered, that supposing if you are having a cornea which is about 500 microns thickness, and you are creating a flap of say 120 microns, and you are ablating about 80 microns to give the correction, 80 plus 120 is about 200, which is less than 45 to 50% of the overall corneal thickness. So this should be PTA, or the percentage of tissue, basically is the sum total of the flap thickness plus the amount of tissue which is being ablated, and that should be less than 45 to 50% of the original corneal thickness. Topography guidelines, again, anything which you have to do, basic instrument or basic readings upon which the whole refractive surgery depends is on the how well you know your machine, how well you are able to assess what are the abnormalities, whether it's really normal or it's only something which is a normal by default. So most of the machines have different indices to indicate whether it could be a case of keratoconus, and normally most of the machines give you a final summary of the indices where it says just whether it's a normal case, whether it's a suspect case, or it's a keratoconus compatible case. But if you just depend on these are the cases where you might miss a form first keratoconus, and these are the cases where you should go into more detail. So even if one indices is abnormal, my suggestion is that instead of rushing into a refractive surgery, you wait for some time. You don't lose anything. Maybe you get back the money 1 year later. It's all right. But you are avoiding a complication like ectasia, which is going to be a nightmare for the rest of your life. So try to study the topography picture very clearly, and then decide accordingly which procedure to be done. Again, wherever, see, if all other things being normal, you have a good thickness, but the keratometric readings are very steep, anything more than 47, 48, I would prefer either a surface treatment or a femto procedure if all other indices are normal. You should aim for a post-treatment KF not less than 34 diopters or not more than 48 diopters. When in doubt, like I said, it's always advisable to wait for 6 to 12 months, repeat the topo, and then decide accordingly. Again, in topography, what are the things which you should see? You should always remember the red flags in topography. These which you are seeing right in front of your eyes now in the slide are mostly pertaining to the op-scan pictures. I would say two or three important things in this would be the anterior to posterior best fit sphere ratio, which should be less than, which should not be less than anything less than 1.22 is ideal. Anything more than 1.26 is definitely not advisable to go ahead. Then a very thin point on the anterior and posterior floors, which are corresponding, which also corresponds with the thinnest point in the on the pachymetry map. That is something which you should see, and you should also know which are the corresponding important indices which you suspect in case OPSCAN is now not there in most of the centers. It's either the Sirius, Galilei, or some other Pentacam or some Allegretto machine which is there. So we have a Sirius machine with us, and we have to see the most important values, even though the indices may be showing it as normal, would be something like a symmetry index front of more than 0.75, or a symmetry index back of more than 0.21 should be something which is suspicious, and you need to wait in these cases. Or also the RMS root mean square back by a value of 0.212 microns per square millimeter is something which is very, very important. In the Pentacam, the most important value would be the BAD-D score of more than 2.6 standard deviations. The two most corresponding values. Sometimes it happens in your practice that you are having a series and the patient already got his topography done elsewhere. It comes with a Pentacam report. So if you want to see corresponding value between the series and the Pentacam, what you need to see is the BAD-D value of the Pentacam, whether it is corresponding to your series value. So these are the two comparable values. So these are some things which you should keep in your mind always. And the most important point would be anything where you see any abnormality on this, my advice is to wait for some time, repeat the procedure, and if the values are not progressing, then you can think of a surface ablation. If not, a femto procedure. But in all these cases where the values are suspect, I would stick myself to either a surface ablation or a femto, not for a conventional microkeratomelasty. The quantum of refractive error, my guidelines is I don't do any surface ablation in patients who are having more than 6 diopters of error. Then more than 6 depending on the thickness, you can have the luxury of choosing any procedure. My first choice would be, like I said, anything less than 6 diopters of error would be a surface treatment because of the less possibility of any flap related. You're not creating a flap, so the chance of flap complications does not arise. Of course, the downside is that you are exposing the surface to the chance of infection, but with proper care, that can be very well avoided. The other downside of it is that the pain and the healing period is much longer as compared to a LASIK or a femtolasic. Then pure cylinders, again, I prefer surface. There is a controversy regarding this. Many people say in surface ablation, there is a regression. But with the current generation of machines, I think all these are incorporated into the system itself, and we hardly find any regression in most of the cases of pure cylinders. We have treated up to 4.5 diopters of pure cylinder without any incidence of regression. Then hyperopes, I always prefer flap procedures uh, because in hyperopes, whatever effect you are producing is a pseudo effect. You are actually supposed to steepen the center, which you cannot do. So you tend to flatten the periphery. So there is an apparent steepening in the center. So there can be a lot of regression if you attempt a surface procedure in hyperopes. So my procedure of choice would be a flap procedure, either femto or a conventional microkeratome LASIK. Always try to strike a balance between the pachymetry, topo parameters, and the affordability. I would like to, as we go along, I would like to uh, mention that affordability plays a very, very important role, and you don't need to push your patient into selecting a higher procedure just because you have it. You be honest with the patient. Then presence of corneal pathology or previous corneal surgery. In the presence of old viral keratitis, defer any surgery because any refractive laser surgery can aggravate the condition. If old scars are present, again, I would prefer to avoid a femtolasic or a smile because you don't get a proper uh, photo treatment, photo ablation in these cases because of the scar interfering, and you can have a breakthrough which can create a buttonhole. Post arc and post penetrating keratoplasty, probably surface is the best bet. Um, then affordability, like I was trying to tell you, in my personal practice, when you convince the patient the advantages of a femto flap as compared to a microkeratome flap. Nowadays, many microkeratomes are available which can give you a reasonably good 100 to 110 micro thickness flap. But if you compare a femto flap of 100 microns to a microkeratome flap of 100 microns, any day, any person would agree that a femto flap is much more stable, much more uniform, and more or less uniplanar as compared to a microkeratome flap. So that gives it more stability, better healing, and more smooth approximation. So I explain all these things to my patient where the topography and the pachymetry support a flap procedure. I always give the choice to my patients because they should be able to decide after knowing what are the pros and cons. If it is affordable, I tell them one simple thing that at the end of the day, at the end of 2 or 3 months, the vision is the same whether you do a femto surface or a microkeratome flap. But during the procedure itself, the chances of complications, then the strength of the flap are things which matter. And I explain this to the patient. And mind you, in most of the cases, the patients prefer to get a femto procedure done. It is an informed consent, and you are not forcing the patient. The patient himself decides that, yes, okay, I am ready for this, even if it is going to cost a little more. You have explained to me the advantages. So he doesn't again sit on your head later and question you, I did not get a better vision because you charged me more. What is the ultimate aim? An uneventful, mutually satisfying result is what should be the goal of any surgical procedure. And in this, both the patient and yourself both have to be equally satisfied. Unsuitable patients with very thin, steep, or very flat corneas or very high errors, avoid laser corneal procedures. If the anterior chamber depth is more than at least 2.7 millimeters and the endothelial cell count is more than 1200, you can think of an ICL. Always cross verify the corneal diameter of a pentacam or a OpScan with a digital caliper. Don't just depend on the corneal diameter, limbus to limbus diameter on the readings of just a pentacam or an OpScan. Always cross check it with a digital caliper. In conclusion, all patients with family history of keratoconus with thin corneas, errors less than 6 diopters, suspect topographic indices, history of prior corneal surgery, narrow palpebral fissures, and pure high cylinders, my preferred choice would be a surface ablation. Good Pachy 500 microns and above, normal topo, good globe exposure, not willing to experience pain in spite of proper counseling, relatively less time for post-op follow-up, like patients who have to go back abroad, LASIK or femtolasic depending on the affordability, unsuitable patients for laser corneal surgery, I would think of an ICL if the anterior chamber depth permits and if there is no endothelial problem. Clear lens extraction is something which I have not done in my practice, and maybe my colleague Dr. Madhukar Reddy could throw some light on this. Now we come to the conclusion of the talks. Uh, we are free to open up for the question answer session.
Manoj, can you take this question? A female patient, first trimester post-trab on maximal glaucoma medication, but with raised IOP, how to manage? By Dr. Manish. Manoj, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I saw the two questions. Number one was pertaining to use of vitamin B12 as a neuroprotective agent. In glaucoma, basically neuroprotection is was experimented with brimonidine in a rat crush model where brimonidine 2% was injected intraperitoneally and that model was subjected to pressure. After that, they noticed the reduction in apoptosis of the nerve cells, whereas the use of vitamin B12 is basically in peripheral neuropathy and all that happens with the folate mechanism, folate this thing. This is not specific to, it is only to prevent neuropraxia kind of effects. Vitamin B12 has a role, but not as a mode of RGC apoptosis prevention. RGC apoptosis prevention was studied basically in brimonidine, calcium channel inhibitors for as antihypertensives. Then memantine initially had some role, but subsequently the role of memantine was given up. And then the last but not the least was the role of antioxidants in trying to prevent apoptosis. Role of vitamin B12 for this mechanism was not studied. It was only for neuropraxia effects and specifically related to peripheral neuropathies. The second question I saw was related to a woman in her first trimester. She's already had trabeculectomy and now she's on maximum medication. This is a catch-22 situation, to be honest. In fact, the management, I think if I can spend about 3 minutes time on this question, I have to explain in detail. The management of glaucoma in a young woman, especially with pre-existing glaucoma, intending to go become pregnant and produce a child, needs to begin in the prenatal period itself. You need to discuss the possibilities, pros and cons, and then think about the surgery, assuming that this patient was done trabeculectomy before her gestation. Now in the first trimester, the only best possible medication that can be used is brimonidine. This is a class 2 medication, and all the other anti-glaucoma medications are basically class 3. Class 3 medications mean, like class 2 medication means that in this it comes to brimonidine. Here it means that animal studies are inconclusive, but human studies have proved useful. On the contrary, human studies are not available, but animal models have proved productive, are positive. In such a situation, the medication is labeled class 2, and in this, only brimonidine fits the bill, whereas beta blockers and carbonic anhydrase inhibitors and prostaglandins in the first trimester specifically, they need to be avoided because they produce keratogenicity. So now in a young woman, pregnant, already TRAB is done, that means the TRAB is failing or the trabeculectomy is not adequate. You can't do resurgery in this situation because anesthetic effects, then all the other modes can cause teratogenic effects to the fetus. Then and at the same time, you are not supposed to use carbonic anhydrase, specifically beta blockers and prostaglandins in the first trimester. So this is really class 2, this is a catch-22 situation. I would rather give the option of even termination of pregnancy depending on the amount of field constriction or the amount of pressure this patient is having. The pregnancy and the glaucoma management needs to be planned beforehand. And when we are discussing about the medication in pregnancy, just in a brief, one sentence I would like to say: in the first trimester, brimonidine is used. In the second trimester, any of the medications. But in the final trimester, prostaglandins are a no-no for the patient because the prostaglandins precipitate premature contraction and premature delivery for the patients. And brimonidine in the late trimester or in the lactation phase, brimonidine needs to be avoided because it is a CNS suppressant and can precipitate apnea for the fetus or the baby when the mother is lactating. So these are the basic guidelines about the management of glaucoma during the pregnancy. In this specific situation, in the first trimester, probably you can think about laser organ node trabeculoplasty if that is possible. Otherwise, it's a real catch-22 situation, and we need to discuss the prognosis with the patient and move forward.
Okay, I'll take the next question. This is Dr. G.V. Prasad asking about, do I have any experience with Indian trifocals? I have not tried any Indian trifocals, but I'm planning to use IOCare trifocal lenses in the near future. So, and just see how they are. I've used both Symphony and PanOptix lenses earlier. The next question is difference between multifocal and trifocal lenses. Basically, a trifocal lens is a type of multifocal lens. Anything more than one focus is called a multifocal lens. So it can be either a bifocal or a trifocal lens. Yeah, multifocal lenses, I've used a lot of IOCare lenses called Acrydiff. So these are reasonably good. So I've been using since many years. It depends on the patient's affordability. Patients who are able to afford a better package with a higher cost, usually I'll go for an MNC lens, but people who want a multifocal lens but have a lesser budget, I go for a IOCare lenses for them, which are basically the cost difference. The next question is difference between lenticular astigmatism and a corneal astigmatism by Dr. Anil Kumar Srivatsava, which we've discussed earlier. Basically, if your spectacle correction has say -3 astigmatism and your keratometry shows only -1 cylindrical power, that is the difference, means lenticular astigmatism is -2. So any difference between the corneal astigmatism and the refractive or your glass astigmatism, glass power astigmatism is the difference, that is lenticular astigmatism. You have to take into consideration only keratometric astigmatism while calculating your IOL power calculation, because the lens will go anyway.
I think I can answer this question.
Yeah.
You want to know, is there any possibility of a severe cataract case becoming a glaucoma case in case of any old age person? Yes, there is a chance, like if it is a long-standing case of lens-induced glaucoma, the glaucoma may set in, especially if you don't attend to the cataract issue in the immediate future. There can be a permanent, after generally in lens-induced glaucoma, after you do a cataract surgery, the pressure generally comes down. The angle closure as a result of lens-induced glaucoma can open up. In case it is a long-standing case, if there are a lot of adhesions in the anterior senecae in the angles, in such a situation, there can be a post-op ocular hypertension. And if there is an associated structural defect in the optic disc, that qualifies as a frank glaucoma, and it needs to be treated that way. As if there are anterior senecae, then it should be treated like an angle closure glaucoma. Try to do a PI if there is a adhesions of more than 180 degrees in the angles. Try to see if some sort of angle can open up, if it can give some sort of a relief for the intraocular pressure. Otherwise, treat it like an open angle glaucoma. If there is a structural defect in the optic disc and a correlating field defect, manage as a case of primary glaucoma. Especially old age, one advantage is that you need not bring down the pressure aggressively. If the field defects are mild to moderate, if the structural defects are early, probably pressure in the early 20s or late teens may be sufficient. Don't subject this patient to aggressive treatment and try to bring down the pressure to 12 to 14. You may be only exposing these old people to effects, side effects, rather than really give them the benefit of neuroprotection and vasoprotection and try to prevent the progression of the disease in these patients. So it is all on a case-to-case basis as to what is the age of the patient, what is the amount of glaucoma that the patient is having post-cataract, what is the mechanism of glaucoma, whether it is angle closure because of long-standing anterior senecae in the angles, or whether it is the angles are absolutely open, but still there is a optic nerve defect that is correlating functionally with the visual field defect. Here again, there is a catch-22 situation. You need to see whether this defect is progressing. If the pressure is in teens and you have detected a field defect, this may be pre-existing during the time of cataract. Now you have removed the cataract, the angle is absolutely open, pressure is in the teens. Is this field defect increasing over a period of time? If it is stable, if the patient is happy, you can probably observe the patient or put the patient on a minimal treatment. If there is progression, then you need to treat it as a frank glaucoma and manage it.
There's another question for you.
Okay.
Cost and efficacy of Rho kinase inhibitors in glaucoma treatment. The last one.
The cost efficacy, as I told you in my presentation, like I am yet to use this molecule. I have spoken only the theoretical aspect here. If this drug was introduced to me about a month before the lockdown, I am yet to see the results of this drug. The cost, I am told, is something like 300 rupees, which is comparatively very good compared to the other anti-glaucoma medication. It may be cost effective, and they say that the advantage in this is it is an anti-inflammatory agent also, and it promotes regeneration of endothelial cells. So in situations, corneal situations like Fuchs endothelial dystrophy, etc., also in where there is a loss of endothelial cells for any kind of pathology, Rho kinase inhibitors can be used, ripasudil. And in glaucoma also, it basically acts by reducing the amount of inflammation, and its chief mode of action is through the trabecular outflow rather than the uveicular outflow. And as I told you, may be cost effective. It is promising. And as I told you in the presentation, it is also seen that it reduces the macular edema. It may be useful for the posterior segment disorders. It may be useful for the corneal specialist. And it has a promise for as an anti-glaucoma medication. I think it will be definitely a cost-benefit advantage for us, but I need to use it personally to give you any kind of a practical personal experience about the molecule.
Another question for me, special biometric calculation for IOL power post-refractive surgery to achieve emmetropia after surgery, which formula is ideal, especially if patient does not have pre-LASIK topo or A-scan, asked by Aparna. So basically, there is this ASCRS calculator, which gives us, which we need to fill up all the requirements, and the company person, I mean, the lenses whom we are ordering from, they also will be able to help you do this from an ASCRS calculator when you don't have any other information. But even the IOL master and the lens, the other thing is the LensStar. They also give reasonably good results, but I feel go ahead with the ASCRS calculator. LASIK in diabetes. Now, Dr. Nandakishore.
Yeah, LASIK in diabetes is not a contraindication as long as the patient is a well-controlled diabetic. But in badly controlled diabetic cases, I don't think I would go ahead with any laser refractive surgery. I have done for many patients who are under very good control as long as 15 to 18 years back, and they are still doing good.
Manoj, in prostaglandin analog group, which is your choice, asked by Dr. Pandurang.
Okay. Okay, so this is earlier like all the anti-prostaglandins and prostaglandin analogs. As of now, we have 4 varieties for us. Initially, it was latanoprost, then came travoprost, after travoprost, bimatoprost, and then now tafluprost. So all the 4 molecules are similar. They all give about 30 to 35% of reduction. And earlier we used to say like the only disadvantage with latanoprost is the maintenance of cold chain. So that was an issue, especially in our country, in our tropical climate. The cold chain process was an issue, whereas for travoprost and bimatoprost, this issue was not there. But it was seen travoprost, they claimed endurance, like even after 72 hours, just in case the patient misses one drop, nothing happens once in a way, because they demonstrated endurance, a long-term benefit of travoprost in their studies. Whereas bimatoprost, initially, it was available in 0.03%, and there used to be a lot of hyperemia issues, and the incidence of allergy was a little more in bimatoprost compared to travoprost and latanoprost. So with the launch of 0.01% bimatoprost now, these issues have been widely addressed, and the latest on the block, tafluprost, promises to be a drug with the least amount of side effects. The amount of hyperemia demonstrated is very less. The side effect profile is quite insignificant, and it holds promise. As the which is better than what? Again, my experience has shown that a patient may be allergic to one prostaglandin. That doesn't mean that the patient is allergic to all prostaglandins and prostamides. You can certainly stop that particular medication and try the another analog or a different prostaglandin medication. Similarly, suppose if the pressure differential is not much, suppose you are expecting 30 to 35% pressure drop, with a particular prostaglandin. If you are not getting that kind of a result, you can switch to another prostaglandin also, and they can give you the desired result. Coming cost-wise, there are studies like they showed that every prostaglandin varies little bit here and there, and compared to the cost factor ranging between 400 rupees to 700 rupees, all are similar. The medication that is costing 400, the drop size matters. Some people come and promote that my molecule, my brand has 3 ml, whereas the competitor original brand has only 2.5 ml. But it is for us to understand that that is a calibrated dropper. The number of drops, if you calculate from that bottle, a 2.5 ml bottle and a 3 ml bottle is quite similar, or in fact, the 2.5 ml gives you more number of drops than the 3 ml bottle. So these are all the permutations and combinations. I can't specifically say which is my drug of choice. Whatever like I feel like seeing the safety profile and my gut feeling, every case we need to start with a particular prostaglandin or a prostaglandin analog and start managing your patient.
Yeah, there is one question by Mr. Amit saying, is it possible to undergo refractive laser surgery, cataract surgery after previous refractive surgery? Yes, most of the patients whom we have done after about 20-25 years, when they become old, they start getting the cataracts and they have to be operated. But like Dr. Madhukar just now said, the calculation of the IOL power would be an issue, and the best bet would be on the ASCRS calculator, which they have compared with many IOL formulas and has been found to be comparable. Look at the other side of it. Do we do refractive laser surgery after cataract? Yes. In my personal practice, I have done about 8 to 10 cases where you ended up with refractive surprises. Especially, I had just done an extracapsular cataract extraction for a high myop as way back as some 28, 29 years back, and he had significant astigmatism. So I corrected both his eyes with refractive laser surgery, and where the astigmatism was around close to 5.5 diopters, he is now having a residual error of about 1.5 diopters of astigmatism, and he is able to read well also with that. So it is possible either way, and all the laser refractive surgery patients, they are young patients, so sometime or the other in their life they would end up as patients for cataract surgery.
Madhukar, for you.
Yeah, please share experience with Eyhance lenses, Dr. Rajesh Agarwal. So I had used about 35 lenses of Eyhance lenses. Basically, I'm using these lenses for patients who drive at night. Because patients who don't drive at night, I do recommend multifocal lenses if they are interested. And but I'm worried about patients who are driving at night, because if I advise a multifocal lens, so they would get dysphotopsias and they might be unhappy. So in such cases, I'm using these lenses. And these Eyhance lenses, patients are happy. I've analyzed them also. Out of these 30 patients, nearly half of them are able to read nearly small print also comfortably. That is about N6 to N8, even for near vision. Intermediate vision, they are happy. Basically, these are the ones who say that they are comfortable at night because there's no glare, and they can see the dashboard properly, they can see the TV properly or a computer properly. But for near vision, they will need glasses in about 50% of patients for small print. For larger print, they'll be able to see. I'm very happy with the lenses, and I've used about 35 lenses in the last 3-4 months since it was launched.
Yeah, I think Madhukar, I think Eyhance lens is basically a lens which should be actively encouraged for patients who work a lot on computers and who drive, because these are two things which you need to see: the computer, your laptop, as well as your dashboard at a distance of about 20 to 24 inches. And I think their best use is in occupations where you need that distance apart from your distant vision.
Yes. Basically, what they've done is in these lenses, they've changed the surface of the lens to be something more like a keratoconus lens. So they're increasing the depth of focus. They don't have any rings or steps on that. So hence this photopsia is less. The nighttime glare is less, or it's similar to monofocal lenses. So there's a continuous curve which changes. There's no steps in that, or different zones are not there.
Nankishore, there is a question for you. 17-year-old with monoocular high myopia 7 diopters.
High myopia of 7 diopters in a 17-year-old. I would probably, because the patient is 17 years old, I would prefer to wait for 1 more year. If it was a younger patient, there was a chance of developing an amblyopia. So I would have gone ahead and tried to do a refractive surgery. But because the patient is 17 years old, I would probably prefer to wait for some more time and see if the myopia is progressing. And then once it reaches a reasonable amount of stability, I would go ahead with the laser surgery.
How to know target IOP for a glaucoma patient who had undergone LASIK? Okay, so it is always advisable that before to the LASIK surgeons, refractive surgeons, they have a baseline reading as when every patient who has undergone LASIK, they will be having a pachymetry recording that is recorded. It is also advisable that an intraocular pressure should be recorded as a routine before undertaking a refractive surgery. And based on that thickness and the parameters that the patient has in the record, we can calibrate. And based on the thickness, like for every 10 micron thinning of the cornea, we adjust the IOP by 1 millimeters of mercury. Based on that, we can get a reasonable amount of this thing, like what can be the likely intraocular pressure corrected to the corneal thickness. So what is vital and what is important is at the time of refractive surgery, what was the baseline intraocular pressure and the pachymetry. Pachymetry will be definitely available with the refractive case sheet, but I would suggest that every case undergoing refractive surgery, if they also document the intraocular pressure prior to cataracts refractive surgery, would definitely help a glaucoma expert in future.
Two things which I would like to add to what Manoj has already said is to look at the flip side of it. Any patient of glaucoma who is very motivated towards undergoing a refractive surgery procedure, I would caution against trying to correct high amounts of error, because you are trying to make the cornea thinner and you don't know how the IOP fluctuations would ultimately end up with. So there is more chance, I would say, about for chances for ectasia in these cases. The second point is any patient who has undergone LASIK and who is showing regression, uh, probably previously not tested for glaucoma, or maybe who is a glaucoma patient who is not under good control, then you have to think of correcting the pressures to the optimal levels before trying to treat these patients for their regression, because ultimately you might end up with overcorrection, because this temporary regression phenomena could only be due to a high pressure, which could be momentary or which could be a short-lived thing, depending on what treatment you are giving and what is the response to the steroids which are using during the procedure, post the procedure.
At last, please share your views. We will be glad. Views in the sense, probably I think Madhukar and Nankishore, I think we have about 12 minutes to wind up. So if all three of us can sum up as to what we are. From my side, from the glaucoma point of view, I would like to say that based on the topic that I spoke today, like every glaucoma drug, we have about four. We now have four prostaglandin and prostaglandin analogs. We have carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. We have brimonidine. We have beta blockers like timolol and bitoxolol, and we have our good old pilocarpine. Don't write off any medication. Treat every case as a case-by-case basis. Try to understand the mechanism as to the underlying pathophysiology for glaucoma. What is the real cause of glaucoma in that particular patient? And once you understand the efficacy of a particular drug, understand the side effects, likely side effects that drug is going to precipitate, and what are the advantages of that drug? Is any drug contraindicated? Based on that, you can take a call as to which should be your first line of medication. And in case you have conclusively come to a diagnosis, established a diagnosis of glaucoma by a structural and functional correlation, and you are 100% sure that this patient requires a lifelong medication for glaucoma, it's better to start with a minimum amount of medication, and the minimum amount of medication giving you a go and also affording you to go for the maximum kill is a prostaglandin or a prostaglandin analog, which gives you a 30 to 35% drop, and that is sufficient generally to achieve your target pressure. In case you are not able to achieve your target pressure, then you need to add a particular second drug to that and then maintain the patient accordingly. Also, it is important that you must know the side effect profile, and especially like if the glaucoma is in the initial stages, if you are thinking that you are able to manage with a gold standard timolol, over a period of 4 to 4.5 years, there is a likely chance of tachyphylaxis with the beta blocker, especially timolol. So you need to constantly monitor the patient, and then subsequently you may need to change the medication. Also, it was observed in healthy adults, like use of timolol over a long period of time precipitated bronchospasm in about 45% of the population. Though you are using timolol in a healthy patient, the quality of life for that patient is slowly over a period of time compromised to a certain extent, and the patient feels lethargic, patient will feel disillusioned, patient may not be having that amount of interest that he used to have. These are all possible indicators to the side effect of beta blockers. You need to assess these situations. You need to assess the quality of life of the patient periodically from time to time and take a call as to which medication you need to use.
Yeah, I have a question by Dr. Parang Naik. What about diabetic patients? Do we prefer monofocal rather than multifocal lens? So here, basically, what is the problem with these diabetic patients? So there are diabetic patients who after 20 years or 30 years also do not have any retinal changes, like either a macular edema or any non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy. But there are some patients who have diabetic retinopathy in forms of any maculopathy, or they have proliferative diabetic NPDR or a PDR changes. So basically, diabetic patients in future can have maculopathy or diabetic retinopathy, and those people should not be suggested a multifocal lens, because that will decrease the quality of vision. So, but there are diabetics who have had diabetes for 30-40 years and absolutely their retina is clear. Those people, with caution, we can use multifocal lenses. But in general, as a policy, we should not use multifocal lenses in diabetics, because they might develop diabetic changes in future. And the treatment also, the retinal surgeons also hate to treat diabetic retinopathy because they can't give an appropriate laser. They can't see the peripheral retina properly. So hence, in general, multifocal lenses have to be avoided, especially in people with diabetic retinopathy. But in diabetics who have long-standing diabetes but no diabetic retinopathy, you can discuss with the patient about the possible long-term effects and then come to a conclusion.
Lankeshwar, probably you can take this last, or Madhukar, either of you two.
Yeah. Refractive lens extraction, like I said, we don't have much experience. Most of the places it's being discouraged, though of late many doctors are going ahead with it. But a point of caution would be that you have to examine the retina thoroughly, and even there is a controversy again whether even normal cases without any degenerative changes, whether you go ahead for a 360-degree barrage laser before taking them up for clear lens extraction. That is one thing. And second thing is probably even if the power is zero, it is better to implant a lens in these cases where the lens is absolutely clear and you are doing it for a refractive purpose. So these are two things. And then in summary, I would like to say that uh, surface ablation has come back in a big way. The initial problem has always been because of the severe amount of pain, photophobia, watering, and all, which the procedure causes in the first 2 to 3 days. But with the advent of trans PRK, which is the machine aided removal of the epithelium, the procedure has become much more tolerable. The pain is for a lesser duration, the healing is faster, and especially with the addition of smart pulse technology, the problems have been have got reduced to a much greater extent. So it has come back in a strong way, and I advise that whoever wants to practice refractive surgery, I would suggest that you need not hesitate or be tense about doing a surface procedure, because this is the way to go for the future. There are much less complications. The only problem would be that patients have to be counseled very thoroughly about the problem like pain, photophobia, and intense watering, the longer duration of the treatment with steroids, and the need to avoid exposure to ultraviolet rays by using some form of protective lenses for the first 3 to 6 months. Once these things are done, the complications like haze and all are very less. With the current generation machines, the risk of or the chance of regression is also much less. So I think it is a safe procedure. Then again, with Smile femtolasic being accepted so well, I think over a period of time, microkeratome LASIK would become less and less because of the safety factors of the other two procedures. So, overall, I think surface ablation, femtolasic, and to some extent, Smile will stay as the procedures of choice in the future.
So I think Lankeshwar, you can wind up the proceedings.
Yeah, we thank everybody for attending this webinar. We have tried to be more practical and try to bring across to you what is more useful in your day-to-day practice rather than going for extensive didactic information. I hope it was very useful to you, and we thank Ofto for coming out and sponsoring this webinar in this difficult times when you have to stay at home. So stay safe, stay healthy, and hope for a smooth comeback to your clinics. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can end the meeting, Mr. Dubey.